In the High Bridger Valley of Montana, in the fall of 1888, the locals saw something that made them stop their wagons and stare. On the south-facing slope of Miller's Hill, a girl no older than 17 was digging a hole. Not a well, not a root cellar. She was carving a life-sized burrow directly into the earth with a broken, re-handled shovel. They thought she'd lost her mind. Some thought she was simple. Others just figured she was desperate. And when the great blizzard of '89 hit with a fury that would be spoken of for a century, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to hear the number that made the Valley's most respected builder go silent, stay until the end. What did this teenage girl understand about heat, wind, and earth that every experienced carpenter in Montana had missed? If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Anna wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 17-year-old orphan with $5, a broken shovel, and one night before the first snows were predicted to fly. She had arrived in the valley a week earlier, the last passenger on a stagecoach line that was shutting down for the winter. She had no family, no connections, and a quiet, watchful intelligence that most people mistook for shyness or a lack of wit. Her past was a collection of harsh lessons learned in the mining camps of the Colorado Rockies, where she'd followed her father from one played-out claim to the next. He wasn't much of a miner, but he was a decent man who had taught her two things of value: how to read the earth and how to depend on no one but herself. After he'd been lost in a tunnel collapse the spring before, Anna had drifted, working small jobs, until her meager savings brought her to this valley, a place she'd heard had work and opportunity. She found neither. The harvest was in, the ranch hands were settled for the winter, and the town was battening down. The only charity came from Sarah Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a kind woman who saw the desperation in Anna's eyes. She offered the girl a space in their attic. "It's not much," she'd said, her voice full of genuine pity. "But it's dry, and it's better than nothing." By frontier standards, the Gables' home was respectable, a two-story frame house built with milled lumber and a brick chimney. But Anna, with an eye trained by a life of making do, saw its flaws immediately. She saw the quarter-inch gaps beneath the doors. She saw the single-pane windows that would weep with frost. She felt the drafts that snaked across the floorboards. During her first night in the attic, lying under a thin quilt, she listened to the wind howling around the eaves. It wasn't just a sound. It was a force, a physical presence that was actively stealing heat from the house, pulling it right through the thin wooden walls. Downstairs, she could hear Mr. Gable get up twice to feed the big cast-iron stove in the parlor. The house consumed wood with a desperate hunger, yet the chill remained. That was the brutal lesson of the High Plains, a lesson the townsfolk had accepted as fact. Winter was a battle. You fought it with endless cords of wood. You fought it by sealing yourself in one room, by stuffing rags into every crack, by accepting that for 5 months of the year you would never truly be warm. Children slept in their coats. Wives found their dishwater frozen in the basin by morning. It was a siege. Anna knew she couldn't survive a siege in that attic. She had no money for a share of the wood, and her pride, the only inheritance her father had left her, wouldn't allow her to be a pure burden. She spent the next day walking the town's perimeter, observing. She watched the way the wind scoured the north-facing walls of buildings, leaving them plastered with early snow. She watched how smoke from chimneys was torn away horizontally, a testament to the air's relentless motion. Wind doesn't just chill the air, it strips heat directly from any surface it touches. A 40-mile-per-hour wind could make 0 degrees feel like 50 below, and it had the same effect on a log cabin as it did on a human cheek. Then she looked at the hills. The low, rolling hills were covered in dormant buffalo grass, swaying in the breeze. But the ground itself was still. The ground, she knew, held a deep, residual warmth from the summer sun. In the mines, even in the dead of winter, the temperature 100 feet down was a constant cool 50 degrees. The earth didn't freeze deeply. It was a massive, stable reservoir of thermal energy. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the wind. The townsfolk built their shelters up into the wind. They fought it. But what if you didn't fight it? What if you simply got out of its way? Her father had once pointed to the simple dugouts used by poor prospectors, shelters that were little more than roofed-over pits. "Ugly as sin, Annie," he'd said, "but warmer than a minister's handshake in July. The earth holds you, the wind can't find you." That was the insight, the connection between the deep earth stability of a mine and the wind-scoured vulnerability of a frame house. Her plan formed, stark and simple in its logic. She wouldn't build up, she would dig in. She went back to Mrs. Gable, thanked her for her kindness, and said she'd found a place. The woman's face was a canvas of concern. But Anna was resolute. She spent 2 of her $5 on the broken shovel at the mercantile. The head was sound, the handle splintered. She spent another 50 cents on a file to sharpen its edge. Then she walked to the hill, found a south-facing slope to catch the winter sun, and began to dig. The opportunity wasn't a surplus sale or a lucky find. It was the cold, hard ground and the knowledge that the first big snow was only a day or 2 away. As the townspeople watched her begin her strange project, they didn't see an engineer at work. They saw a fool. The work was brutal. The topsoil was a few inches thick, giving way to a dense clay-like earth packed with rock. Her first task was to fix the shovel. She used a small hand axe she carried to shape a new handle from a sturdy aspen branch, fitting it into the shovel's metal socket with painstaking precision. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. She chose her spot carefully, not just a south-facing slope, but one with a slight natural depression, a place where the hill was already giving way. This would save her a day of digging. She marked out a rectangle, roughly 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. This would be her living space. Then she started carving into the hillside. It was less like digging and more like quarrying. Each shovelful was a victory. She wasn't just moving dirt. She was creating shelter from the dirt itself. For 2 days, she worked from sunup to sundown, a solitary, determined figure on the hillside. The physics of her plan were woven into every action. As she dug deeper, the air around her grew still. The wind whistled over the top of the pit she was creating, but inside there was calm. This was the first principle: defeat the wind. Moving air is the greatest thief of heat. Still air is an insulator. By digging into the earth, she was placing 100 feet of solid ground between her and the north wind. On the 3rd day, Silas Croft, who ran the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in the valley, rode out to see what the gossip was about. He was a big man, practical, not unkind, but with a firm belief in the right way to do things. He watched her for a few minutes, his brow furrowed. "What do you think you're doing, girl?" he asked, his voice booming. Anna paused, leaning on her shovel. "Building a place to winter." Croft scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "You're digging a grave. This ground is heavy. Without proper framing, a 16-inch stud wall with cross-bracing, this'll come down on you in the first big thaw. Or worse, the damp will get in, the ground sweats. You'll be sleeping in a mud puddle by Christmas." "I'll have bracing," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "With what? You can't afford lumber." "There's scrap behind your mill," she stated, not asked. He looked taken aback. "That's scrap for a reason. It's twisted. It's split. Not fit for building." "It's fit for this," she replied, and turned back to her digging. He watched for another minute, shook his head, and rode off. The interruption was a reminder of the clock ticking. She worked faster. Once the hole was about 6 feet deep at the back, sloping up to the front. She turned her attention to the structure. She spent a morning hauling the scrap Croft had dismissed. Warped beams, split planks, old railroad ties someone had discarded. To a carpenter, it was junk. To Anna, it was a resource. She selected the thickest, strongest pieces, 2 gnarled 10-foot posts that had probably been intended for a corral, and set them as the main uprights for her entrance. She dug deep holes, set them firmly, and packed the earth around them until they were immovable. A thick crosspiece, a rejected lintel from a cabin build, went on top. This was her doorframe, the anchor for the entire structure. She built the front wall not like a house, but like a retaining wall. She laid the planks horizontally, stacking them, backfilling with dirt as she went. This created a thick, composite barrier of wood and earth. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. A conventional log cabin has walls maybe 8 inches thick. Anna's front wall was 2 feet thick, and her other 3 walls were, for all practical purposes, infinitely thick. They were the entire state of Montana. For the roof, she laid smaller logs and thick planks across the top, extending from the front crosspiece back to the solid earth at the rear of the dugout. It was a low roof, barely 6 feet high. A taller man would have to stoop, but Anna knew that heating a large volume of air was a waste of energy. A small space was an efficient space. The next challenge was moisture, just as Croft had warned. But Anna had a plan for that, too. She spent her last $3.50 at the mercantile. Not on food, but on a 20-foot roll of surplus tar paper and 2 sections of 6-inch stovepipe. She laid the tar paper over her wooden roof structure, overlapping the seams carefully. This was her waterproof membrane. It was the most crucial part of the build. Then she began the laborious process of moving the excavated earth back onto the roof. She piled it on, a foot thick, packing it down, and finally, carefully transplanting the sod she had set aside at the very beginning. From the outside, when she was finished, it didn't look like a shelter. It looked like a small, natural mound on the hillside, a slight swelling of the earth with a low, dark doorway set into its face, like a badger's set, only bigger. She dug a shallow trench, a little moat, around the entrance to divert any surface runoff, and inside she installed the stovepipe in a corner, running it up through a carefully sealed hole in the roof. This was her chimney. It would draw smoke out and, just as importantly, pull fresh air in, keeping the small space from getting stagnant and damp. It was a ventilation system as critical as the roof for managing moisture. The whole thing operated on a simple principle, like the dead air in a double-pane window. The earth was one pane, her small fire the other, and her living space was the pocket of calm, stable air in between. Total cost, $4.75. The shovel repair, the tar paper, the stovepipe, and a handful of nails. Missus. Gable came out on the fifth day, her face etched with worry. She saw the finished mound, the dark opening. It looked primitive, desperate. "Anna, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "The first snow is coming tonight. Come back with me. People are going to think we've lost our minds, letting you do this." Anna stood in the doorway of her earthen home. She looked at the kind woman and then at the gray, heavy sky. "Let them," she said softly. And when the neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw poverty and foolish pride. The ridicule started before the first flake of snow fell. It began as murmurs at the general store, then grew into open mockery. Silas Croft, the carpenter, held court by the pot-bellied stove, explaining to anyone who would listen the technical flaws of Anna's project. "The hydrostatic pressure alone will buckle that front wall," he declared, gesturing with a piece of kindling. "And the frost heave will tear that roof apart from below. The ground is a powerful engine, and she's treating it like a sandbox. That thing will be a frozen tomb by January. The ground sweats, girl," he'd told her. "You'll be sleeping in mud." He wasn't being cruel, not in his mind. He was being factual. He was a man who worked with plumb lines and square angles, and Anna's burrow offended his professional identity. When he saw her in town, he'd just shake his head with a look of profound disappointment. Anna's only response when told of his predictions was a quiet, "We'll see." The more direct cruelty came from the younger men and boys with too much time on their hands. A lanky ranch hand named Jeb saw her buying a small bag of beans and called out across the store, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, Badger Annie, find any good worms down there?" A wave of snickers followed. The name stuck. To the town, she was no longer Anna. She was Badger Annie, the crazy girl who lived in a hole. They'd ride their horses past her hill, pointing and laughing. She never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply continued her work, banking the earth higher on the north side, gathering a small but neat pile of dry firewood. Mrs. Gable felt the pressure most acutely. At her quilting circle, the other women would fall silent when she entered. Then came the hushed questions, dripping with pity. "Sarah, how is that poor girl? Is it true she's living in the dirt? Doesn't she know how dangerous that is?" They saw Sarah's charity as enabling a foolish, stubborn child. They made her feel responsible. The institutional concern came next, in the form of Sheriff Brody. He was a fair man, burdened by the responsibility of a huge, sparsely populated county. He rode out to the dugout one afternoon, his face grim. He was required to inspect homesteads, and this wasn't in any manual he'd ever seen. "Anna," he said, staying on his horse, "I can't have this. It's not decent. A young woman living alone in a hole in the ground. If something happens to you, it's on me." "Nothing will happen to me, Sheriff," she said. "You don't know that. Croft says it's a death trap. I want you to pack up and go to the Gables. That's an order." "With all due respect, Sheriff, Anna said, her voice remaining level. "You can order me off this land, since it's not mine, but you can't order me into a house that will be colder than this one." Brody was stumped. She wasn't breaking any real law, she was just violating every norm of common sense. He left, muttering that he'd be back. The cut that went deepest came, as it always does, from the person who meant to be kind. Mrs. Gable made one last trip to the dugout, her face a mask of desperation. "Anna, you have to listen," she said, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "This isn't just about being warm. It's about how things look. People are going to think you're either too proud to accept help or too foolish to know any better. Maybe both. They think you're incompetent or just plain crazy." Anna looked at the woman who had shown her the only real kindness in this valley. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." She paused, realizing her slip. "I mean, I'm trying to keep myself warm." By the time the first hard frost of November coated the valley in a glittering sheet of white, not one person thought Anna had solved a problem. They thought she'd built a monument to her own stubborn foolishness. They waited for the cold to teach her the lesson they could not. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Anna right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then January came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1889 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It didn't arrive with a single dramatic storm. It was a slow, crushing siege of Arctic air that settled over the northern plains and refused to leave. The escalation was relentless. On January 5th, the thermometer at the Mercantile registered minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A week later, on January 12th, it fell to minus 31. By January 18th, the mercury was frozen at the bottom of the tube, stuck at its limit of minus 40. An alcohol thermometer brought out by a surveyor registered minus 47, and with it came the wind. A constant, brutal wind from the north, blowing at 40 to 50 miles per hour, scouring every exposed surface and driving wind chills to a level that was not just uncomfortable, but lethal. It was a cold that broke tools, split trees, and killed livestock where they stood. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature in the Bridger Valley never once climbed above zero. The town hunkered down. Survival became a full-time job. The community's suffering was measured in cords of wood. Silas Croft, in his well-built two-story house, was burning through a cord of his best-seasoned pine every 5 days. His family lived entirely in the parlor. Blankets hung over the doorways to the rest of the house. Still, the temperature on the wall away from the stove hovered at a miserable 42 degrees. They were burning a forest just to stay above freezing. The Colby Ranch, 5 miles out of town, was losing cattle daily. They had 2 stoves going, one in the main house and one in the bunkhouse, and were burning nearly 2 cords of wood a week. Their windows were opaque, with an inch of interior frost. The men took turns staying up all night to feed the fires, a constant, exhausting vigil against the cold. Failure came in 100 small ways. Chimneys, caked with the soot of fast-burning green wood, caught fire. Pipes froze and burst. Families ran out of dry, seasoned logs and were forced to burn unseasoned cottonwood, a wet, smoky wood that produced more hiss than heat. A pound of water, Anna knew, requires over 1,000 BTUs of energy just to turn into steam. Every pound of water in a green log was heat that never made it into the room. People were burning wood just to dry the rest of the log, a thermodynamic nightmare. Children were sick, huddled under piles of blankets, their breath pluming in the frigid indoor air. Some families, in desperation, started burning furniture. And then people started noticing the hill, or rather, the lack of activity on the hill. A trapper making his way to town on snowshoes passed by Anna's dugout. He saw no signs of distress, no frantic chopping of wood, no clouds of desperate smoke billowing from a chimney. All he saw was a thin, lazy curl of white smoke rising from the stovepipe, barely visible against the snow-covered mound. The entrance was clear of drifts, suggesting a surprising lack of wind eddy. It was a picture of calm in a world of crisis. He mentioned it at the store. "That little mole girl," he said, "seems to be doing all right." Sheriff Brody heard the trapper's report, and his concern shifted from civic duty to genuine fear. Calm, in these conditions, could mean the worst. No smoke could mean no fire. No activity could mean she had frozen, another victim of the great cold. He'd been putting it off, but he couldn't wait any longer. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, pulled on his snowshoes, and started the half-mile trek to the hill. The wind was a solid wall, stealing his breath. He expected to find a tragedy. He was preparing himself to break down a frozen door and find a body. If you're still with me, stay with me, because the number that came out of this dugout didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the known laws of their world. Sheriff Brody reached the mound of earth, his beard a solid mass of ice. Snow crunched under his boots. The wind howled over his head, but down by the low door the air was eerily still. He saw no frost around the doorframe, which was strange. He knocked, his gloved hand making a dull thud. He was ready to put his shoulder through the wood. He heard a slight shuffle, and the door swung inward. The warmth hit him first. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, steady, pervasive warmth. It hit him like stepping into a different season. He stood there, dumbfounded, as his frozen eyelashes began to melt. And then he saw her. Anna was sitting at a small, rough-hewn table, mending a sock by the light of a single candle. She was wearing a simple wool shirt and trousers, not a coat, not a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders, just a shirt. Behind her, the small space was orderly and calm. A neat bedroll lay in one corner. A few books were stacked against the earthen wall. There was no frost on the walls. There was no dampness in the air. It smelled faintly of dry earth, wood smoke, and brewing tea. "Sheriff?" she said, her voice calm. "Are you all right?" He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence and warmth of the dugout, a shocking contrast to the raging blizzard. "Anna, I thought—" "I'm fine, Sheriff," she said, gesturing to a stool. "We're managing fine." She used the word "we," as if the shelter itself were her partner in this. His eyes scanned the tiny space, trying to understand. He saw her stove, a small makeshift thing cobbled together from a metal box, feeding the stovepipe he'd seen from outside, and next to it, her woodpile. It was tiny, a small stack of dry aspen branches and split logs that wouldn't have lasted his own stove 2 hours. "That's all the wood you have inside?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "It's all I need for a day or two," she replied. "The firebox is small. I burn 3 or 4 small logs at a time. It stays warm for hours." Brody unbuttoned his coat. He was starting to sweat. He pulled a small brass pocket thermometer from his vest. It was a reliable instrument. He used it to settle bets at the mercantile. The mercury was huddled at the bottom, reading well below zero from his walk over. He hung it on a small nail that Anna had hammered into one of the wooden support posts. "Do you mind?" he asked. "Not at all," she said, and went back to her mending. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the tiny fire and the distant scream of the wind passing harmlessly overhead. The sheriff watched the thermometer. The silver line crept upwards, past 0, past 10, past 20. It climbed steadily, without hesitation, past 30, past 40, past 50. It finally came to a rest on a clear, undeniable line. 58 degrees. 58 degrees, Brody whispered, more to himself than to her. He took the thermometer down and held it in his hand, as if the warmth of his fingers might have influenced it. But the reading was firm. Outside, he knew the official temperature was minus 38 degrees, not counting the wind that made it feel like minus 80. He was standing in a room that was 96 degrees warmer than the air outside. A 96-degree difference. Let that sink in for a moment. Silas Croft, the best builder in the valley, with unlimited access to wood and a massive stove, was fighting to maintain a 45-degree difference in his parlor. Anna, a 17-year-old girl with scrap lumber and a fire you could hold in your arms, was achieving more than double that in a shelter that cost less than $5. The sheriff, a man of facts and evidence, had to verify. He walked to the packed earth walls and laid his bare hand against them. They were cool to the touch, but not cold. They felt solid, inert, and absolutely dry. He looked up at the ceiling of planks and sod. No drips, no condensation. The small fire and the clever flue were creating just enough air circulation to carry all the moisture away. He had just come from the Miller homestead, where the family was huddled in the kitchen, burning green wood, shivering in a room that had hit 40 degrees. They were miserable. Anna was comfortable. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. The town was fighting a war against the cold. Anna had simply signed a peace treaty with the earth. Word traveled, even in the storm. Brody went back to town not with a story of a tragedy, but with a report of a miracle. He brought Silas Croft back with him 2 days later. The carpenter entered the dugout with the same skepticism he'd shown from the beginning. He didn't speak. He just looked. He ran his hand over the scrap wood walls. He inspected the joints of the roof beams. He knelt and examined the stove and the small, efficient fire within. He stood and stared at Sheriff Brody's thermometer, which again confirmed the impossible number. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching out. Finally, he turned to Anna, his expression not of defeat, but of profound, unsettling revelation. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice low and rasped. "We've been doing this all wrong for 50 years. We've been fighting the cold. You're just avoiding it." It was more than just warmth. It was dignity. Anna wasn't just surviving. She was living. In the afternoons, she read the 2 books she owned. She mended her clothes. She slept through the night, not waking every 2 hours to feed a hungry fire. Her tiny shelter had turned winter from something to be endured into something to simply be lived through. When Brody asked how she was so sure of the temperatures, she produced a small ledger. She had been meticulously recording the outdoor temperature at dawn and dusk, the interior temperature, and the exact amount of fuel consumed. This wasn't luck, it was data. By the time the great cold broke in February, half the valley knew that something impossible was happening on Miller's Hill. The girl they had called Badger Annie had built the warmest, most efficient home in the entire state of Montana. The vindication wasn't a single moment, but a slow, rolling tide of acceptance. The first convert was Tom Miller, the homesteader whose family Sheriff Brody had found shivering in their kitchen. During the worst of the blizzard, their chimney had failed, filling the cabin with smoke and forcing them to put the fire out. Desperate, remembering the sheriff's story, Tom made his way to Anna's dugout. He didn't come to mock. He came to learn. Anna didn't lecture. She showed him. She took him outside and pointed to where the snow had drifted deeply against a cut bank. The principle is the same, she explained. Snow is a good insulator. The ground is better. Dig into the snow, down to the earth. Line it with pine boughs. A small shelter is a warm shelter. Following her simple instructions, Tom and his oldest son dug a temporary snow cave, a quinsy reinforced with branches, against the hillside. It was crude and cramped, but for the last week of the storm, it kept his family from freezing. It worked. That single act of desperation and its success proved the concept was replicable. When spring finally arrived, the valley was changed. The shared trauma of the great cold had broken old certainties. That summer, 7 families dug new, deep root cellars, but they built them with heavy-duty doors and small ventilation shafts, designed to double as emergency storm shelters. Silas Croft, a man humbled by a 17-year-old girl, began offering a new design, a banked cabin built directly into a hillside with a conventional front, but with 3 sides protected by the earth. By the following winter, 19 families had implemented some version of Anna's design. The Bridger dugout, as it came to be called, was no longer a mark of foolishness. It was a symbol of hard-won wisdom. Sheriff Brody, in his annual report to the territorial government in Helena, included a 3-page supplement. It detailed the construction of Anna's shelter, including her own meticulous records of temperature and fuel consumption. He called it a revelation in low-cost, high-efficiency sheltering for Plains homesteaders. He made sure to name her as the innovator. The report was filed away, an obscure piece of bureaucratic history, but it served as the official, institutional validation of her quiet genius. What Anna had built on that hillside in 1888, out of necessity and instinct, anticipated by nearly a century what building scientists would later call passive geothermal design and earth-sheltered construction. She had no academic terms for it. She just had the lessons of the mines and an observant eye. Years later, when Silas Croft's own grandson asked her how she knew it would work when everyone else was so certain it would fail, her answer was simple. She looked out at the rolling hills, green with new grass. "The earth is warmer than the wind," she said. "It isn't complicated." She never patented anything, never charged for her advice. For her, it was never about being right. It was about being safe. The physical structure on the hill is gone now, the timbers of the entrance long since rotted away. But if you know where to look, you can still see the depression in the hillside, a shallow, rectangular hollow where a teenage girl once carved out a life for herself. It's a small indentation, a quiet legacy. The frontier didn't ultimately reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet competence of those who observed the fundamental rules of the world, not just the rules of men. Drop a comment and let us know. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom every week. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier survival techniques. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the engineering principles of earth-sheltered construction are based on real historical practices used by pioneers and indigenous peoples for centuries.